Tomorrow night, we'll explore how the world changed in the aftermath of these plague outbreaks, how societies rebuilt, how power structures shifted, and how the biological legacy of plague resistance continues to influence human health even in our modern age. But for now, let the courage of Ayam's villagers accompany you into dreams, a quiet testament to humanity's capacity for sacrifice, survival, and ultimately, hope. Let's journey back now to the aftermath of the 14th century Black Death. While Ayam's story from the 1660s shows us the courage of a single village, the great pandemic of the 1300s transformed entire societies. As we drift deeper into this historical dreamscape, let's explore how surviving such catastrophe reshaped the medieval world. Imagine yourself once more in that small village we visited earlier, but now it's 1352. The initial waves of plague have finally subsided, leaving a transformed landscape both physically and socially. As you walk through the village that was once home to 200 souls, you count perhaps 90 people remaining. Empty cottages stand like hollow-eyed skulls along the lane, their thatched roofs beginning to collapse without maintenance, their gardens overgrown with weeds. Yet amid this desolation, subtle signs of change are appearing, changes that will eventually alter the very foundations of medieval society. In the fields surrounding the village, the transformation is immediately visible. Before the plague, every available piece of land was cultivated, even marginal soils that yielded poor harvests. Generations of population growth had pushed farming onto less and less productive terrain as people desperately tried to produce enough food for growing families. Now, with so many dead, land is suddenly abundant. Survivors abandon the least fertile fields entirely, focusing their labor on the best soils. This simple shift dramatically improves crop yields per person. Where once a peasant family might have struggled to produce enough to feed themselves after paying taxes and tithes, now they often harvest a surplus. For those who survived the apocalyptic mortality, food is more plentiful than it has been in living memory. After centuries of existing on the edge of hunger, this abundance feels miraculous, a small compensation for the emotional devastation of losing so many family members and neighbors. Changes in diet soon follow. Before the plague, most peasants subsisted primarily on grain. Bread, porridge, and ale formed the bulk of their nutrition, with meat as a rare luxury. Now, with fewer mouths to feed and more land available, many convert fields to pasture for raising animals. Meat, cheese, and butter appear more frequently on humble tables. The average height of the population, which had been declining due to poor nutrition, begins to increase again as diets improve. But the most profound changes come in the relationship between workers and landowners. The massive population loss, roughly half of Europe's people, creates an acute labour shortage. Fields still need ploughing, crops need harvesting, cloth needs weaving, buildings need repairs. Yet there are simply not enough hands to do all the necessary work. For surviving peasants and artisans, this new reality brings unprecedented leverage. Consider the case of Thomas Fletcher, a ploughman in your village. Before the plague, he worked the fields 6 days a week in exchange for a small plot of land to farm for himself and his family. If he complained or failed to provide the required labour service, dozens of other hungry peasants stood ready to take his place. Now, with half the village's workers dead, the local manor's steward approaches Thomas with an extraordinary offer: a larger plot of land, a reduction in labour service from 6 days to 3, and the freedom to work for wages on other manors if he wishes. The steward makes this offer not out of generosity, but necessity. Without Thomas's skilled ploughing, fields will lie fallow, and everyone, including the lord of the manor, will suffer. Similar scenes play out across Europe. Peasants who for generations had been bound to the land as serfs suddenly find themselves with options. Many landlords offer freedom from serfdom as an incentive to keep workers on their estates. Others convert labour obligations to simple rent payments, allowing peasants to farm the land as they see fit as long as they pay the agreed amount. For skilled workers, the changes are even more dramatic. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, weavers all find their services in desperate demand. Wages for such workers double, triple, or even quadruple in the years immediately following the plague. A skilled carpenter who could once barely feed his family now builds a 2-room house with glass windows, wears better clothing, and eats meat 3 times a week. These changes alarm the nobility and wealthy merchant classes. They see the traditional social order crumbling as former serfs demand better treatment and common labourers live like minor gentry. Throughout Europe, authorities attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force workers back into their previous conditions. In England, the government issues the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, followed by the more comprehensive Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws prohibit employers from offering higher wages than had been paid before the plague, forbid workers from leaving their homes to seek better opportunities elsewhere, and attempt to fix prices for food and other goods. Similar legislation appears across Europe. France enacts wage controls in 1351, as does the city-state of Florence. The Spanish Kingdom of Castile tries to prevent peasant mobility with its own labour laws. But these efforts largely fail. The labour shortage is simply too severe, the economic pressures too great. Enforcement proves nearly impossible in rural areas, where local officials, themselves often dependent on good relations with the remaining workers, turn a blind eye to violations. Workers develop creative ways to circumvent wage controls. A carpenter prohibited from accepting more than a certain daily wage might receive gifts of food, clothing, or housing in addition to his official pay. A farm labourer might work slowly or carelessly unless offered better terms than the law allows. For those enforcing the laws, the mathematics is unforgiving. Before the plague, a lord might have had 100 peasants working his land. Now he has 50 or fewer. Punishing one worker by imprisonment or fines only worsens his labour shortage. And if he treats his workers too harshly, they might simply leave, regardless of legal prohibitions against such mobility, knowing they'll find welcome employment elsewhere. The situation comes to a head in various peasant revolts across Europe. In 1358, the rural areas around Paris erupt in the Jacquerie Rebellion as peasants attack castles and noble estates. Though brutally suppressed, it demonstrates the new confidence of the labouring classes. In England, tensions simmer for decades until 1381, when they explode in the Peasants' Revolt. Led by Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, and a radical priest named John Ball, tens of thousands of commoners march on London, demanding an end to serfdom, the abolition of the hated poll tax, and greater social equality. John Ball's famous sermon captures the revolutionary spirit of the moment. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He asks rhetorically, questioning the very idea of aristocratic privilege. From the beginning, all men were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. Though the English revolt, like the Jacquerie, is eventually suppressed through a combination of false promises and brutal force, it represents a profound shift in consciousness. Peasants who once accepted their subordinate position as divinely ordained now openly question the social hierarchy. Workers who formerly had little choice but to accept whatever terms were offered now demand better treatment as their due. The economic and social transformations following the plague aren't limited to rural areas. Towns and cities experience their own profound changes. Urban centres had suffered particularly high mortality during the pandemic due to their crowded conditions. Florence, one of medieval Europe's largest cities, loses as much as 75% of its population. This devastating loss creates opportunities for survivors. Housing, previously scarce and expensive in successful cities, suddenly becomes abundant and affordable. Apprentices find themselves elevated to master status years earlier than normal, as guilds lose many of their senior members. Women, traditionally excluded from many occupations, enter trades left vacant by dead male relatives. Consider the story of Margareta, a weaver's widow in a small market town. Before the plague, she was permitted to help her husband in his workshop, but could not operate as an independent artisan. Guild regulations expressly forbade women from owning a weaving business. When her husband dies of plague, leaving Margareta with his tools, loom and expertise she'd gained working alongside him, the depleted Weavers Guild faces a choice. Enforce the prohibition against female members and lose a skilled practitioner, or adapt to the new reality. Faced with falling membership and rising demand for cloth, the Guild admits Margareta as a full member, one of dozens of similar compromises made across Europe as necessity trumps tradition, though such opportunities for women would eventually contract as populations recovered. For several generations after the plague, women enjoy expanded economic roles unimaginable before the pandemic. The plague's aftermath also witnesses changes in fashion, art, and architecture. The immense mortality creates a new consciousness of death's inevitability and life's fragility. The macabre emerges as an artistic theme. Skeletal figures, death's heads, scenes of the dance of death where skeletons lead people from all social classes to the grave. Yet, alongside this morbid fascination comes a celebration of life and its pleasures. Survivors, perhaps conscious of how quickly existence can end, embrace luxury and beauty with renewed appreciation. Among those who can afford it, clothing becomes more elaborate and colourful. The drab, practical garments of earlier medieval periods give way to rich fabrics, bold designs, and status-signifying styles. The nobility, alarmed by commoners dressing above their station, attempt to enforce sumptuary laws dictating what each social class may wear. These edicts, like the wage controls, prove largely unenforceable. A prosperous artisan's wife might technically be prohibited from wearing silk, but if she can afford it, who in her community has both the authority and motivation to stop her? Religious attitudes undergo their own transformation. The church, which had dominated medieval intellectual and spiritual life, faces a crisis of authority. Many priests and monks fled their posts during the plague, abandoning their flocks when spiritual comfort was most needed. Others stayed and died, leaving parishes without leadership. Monasteries, with their communal living arrangements, suffered particularly high mortality rates, wiping out centuries of accumulated knowledge and tradition. More fundamentally, the plague raises uncomfortable theological questions. If the disaster is divine punishment, as many church authorities claim, why do the virtuous and sinful die alike? Why do devout monks perish while seemingly impious laypeople survive? If prayer and penance are the remedies, why do outbreaks often hit monasteries hardest of all? No satisfactory answers emerge from traditional theology. Instead, two divergent religious trends develop. Some survivors embrace even more fervent piety, seeing their survival as evidence of divine favor that demands grateful devotion. Others adopt a more skeptical, questioning attitude toward religious authorities who failed to explain or mitigate the catastrophe. This questioning spirit, combined with the economic changes that give ordinary people more resources and leisure time, creates fertile ground for the intellectual flowering that will eventually become the Renaissance. When fewer hands must produce society's necessities, more minds can turn to art, philosophy, science, and literature. Education, previously restricted mainly to clergy and nobility, gradually becomes available to a wider segment of society. Newly prosperous merchants and artisans want their children to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, skills useful for business as well as markers of rising social status. Small schools appear in towns and even larger villages, teaching practical knowledge alongside traditional religious instruction. The plague's demographic shock also accelerates technological innovation. With labor scarce and expensive, techniques that save human effort become increasingly valuable. Watermills, long used for grinding grain, are adapted for new purposes, powering bellows for blast furnaces, driving hammers for metalworking, fulling cloth. Printing technology, which will eventually revolutionize the spread of knowledge through Europe, receives early impetus from the post-plague labor shortage. Handwritten manuscripts, each requiring months of a skilled scribe's time, become prohibitively expensive when such workers can command premium wages. The economic pressure to find mechanical alternatives helps drive the development of movable type printing in the mid-15th century. Perhaps most profoundly, the plague experience shakes medieval Europe's acceptance of unchanging tradition. When half the population dies in a few short years, when social hierarchies crumble and rebuild in new forms, when previously unquestioned authorities fail to provide protection or explanation, the idea that the world must remain as it has always been loses its power. After the Black Death, more people can imagine alternatives to existing arrangements, different ways of organizing work, distributing resources, structuring authority. Most of these alternatives are never realized, and many that are implemented prove temporary. But the psychological barrier against change itself weakens, creating space for the innovations in thought, technology, art, and social organization that will eventually transform medieval Europe into the early modern world. For individuals living through these changes, the experience is less about grand historical transformations and more about practical daily adjustments. Thomas the Ploughman doesn't think about the decline of feudalism. He thinks about negotiating better terms with the manor steward so his family can eat better than before. Margareta the Weaver doesn't consider herself part of a gender revolution. She's simply using her skills to support herself after losing her husband. Yet these individual adaptations, multiplied across millions of survivors throughout Europe, collectively reshape society. Like water gradually wearing away stone, the countless small decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances erode and eventually transform the seemingly solid structures of medieval life. Not all these changes are immediately positive, of course. The labour shortage that benefits workers creates hardship for many landowners. Some estates fail entirely, their owners unable to adapt to the new economic realities. Churches, monasteries, and charitable institutions that depended on steady rents and donations struggle to maintain their operations with reduced income. Criminal activity increases in some areas as poorly supervised young men with improved incomes spend freely on alcohol and find themselves in trouble. Abandoned properties in rural areas sometimes become havens for outlaws. Urban governments worry about maintaining order with depleted watch forces. For several decades after the initial plague outbreak, recurring smaller epidemics continue to hit European communities, preventing population recovery and reinforcing the economic and social changes the first pandemic initiated. Not until the late 15th century does Europe's population begin sustained growth again, and it takes until the 17th century to reach pre-plague levels in many regions. This prolonged demographic depression means that the changes set in motion by the Black Death have time to become entrenched. What might have been temporary disruptions instead become new norms. By the time population pressure begins to reverse some of the economic advantages for common workers, other aspects of medieval society have been permanently altered. For the peasant family we've followed through our story, the decades after the plague bring gradual improvement. Your brother, who miraculously survived his bout with the disease, eventually takes over a neighbouring farm left vacant by a family with no survivors. What would have been impossible before the plague, a peasant accumulating a significant land holding, becomes achievable in the depopulated countryside. Your father, whose carpentry skills are in high demand, secures a contract to help rebuild the local church, damaged by years of neglect during the plague years. The payment he receives allows him to add a second room to your family's cottage and replace the dirt floor with wooden planks. Small luxuries that would have seemed unimaginable in the pre-plague era. Your mother teaches you and your sister to read, a skill she learned while working as a servant in a merchant's household before marriage. Before the plague, such knowledge would have had little practical value for peasant children, but in the changing world of the late 14th century, literacy opens doors previously closed to those of humble birth. One autumn evening, as your family gathers around the hearth after the day's work, your father speaks words that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. "Perhaps you could be a clerk," he says to you, nodding thoughtfully. "The abbey is seeking someone who can read and write to help with their records. The pay would be good, and the work is not hard on the body." Your brother laughs, not unkindly. "A clerk? From our family? What would grandfather say to that?" The idea of a peasant's child entering such work would indeed have seemed absurd to earlier generations, for whom rigid social boundaries appeared as natural and immovable as the stars. But as you fall asleep that night, the possibility settles in your mind not as an outlandish dream, but as a genuine opportunity. This, perhaps, is the most significant legacy of the Black Death, not just the immediate changes in wages, working conditions, and social structures, but the expansion of what ordinary people can imagine for themselves and their children. As dawn approaches and this part of our historical journey comes to a close, we leave you in this moment of possibility. Your world has been shattered by incomprehensible loss, then slowly rebuilt into something different than what came before. The medieval certainties that once governed life have been questioned, challenged, and in some cases overturned. What you cannot know as a survivor living through these changes is that you stand at a pivotal moment in Western history. The adaptations, innovations, and reconsiderations forced by the plague will eventually contribute to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and ultimately the emergence of the modern world. But that is a story for our final night together, when we'll explore how the long shadow of the Black Death extends across centuries, influencing art, science, medicine, and society in ways that continue to shape our world today. As our journey through the world of plague survivors nears its end, let's widen our view to see how the ripples from the Black Death continue to spread outward through time, shaping the world in ways both subtle and profound. The echoes of this medieval catastrophe still resonate today in our bodies, our societies, and our understanding of disease. Let's begin with perhaps the most remarkable legacy, the biological inheritance carried by descendants of plague survivors. Remember the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation we discussed, the genetic quirk that protected some medieval Europeans from the plague? This tiny variation in DNA didn't disappear when the plague retreated. It was passed down through generations, enriched in the European gene pool because those who carried it were more likely to survive and have children. Fast forward 600 years to the late 20th century, a new pandemic emerges, HIV/AIDS, killing millions worldwide. Medical researchers, racing to understand this new disease, make a startling discovery. Some people appear naturally resistant to HIV infection, despite repeated exposure. Further investigation reveals why. Many carry the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, the same genetic variation that helped their ancestors survive the Black Death. The connection becomes clear when scientists understand how both diseases operate. Both the plague bacterium and HIV use the CCR5 protein as a gateway into human cells. The Delta 32 mutation alters this protein, effectively barricading the door that these pathogens try to enter. A genetic adaptation selected by one deadly disease in the 14th century unexpectedly provides protection against an entirely different threat in the 20th. This discovery led to the development of new HIV drugs that block the CCR5 receptor, mimicking what the mutation does naturally. In a very real sense, medieval plague survivors have helped save lives in our modern age, their genetic legacy providing a crucial clue in fighting a disease they could never have imagined. But the biological impact of the plague extends beyond this single mutation. The Black Death acted as an intense force of natural selection, potentially influencing other aspects of the immune system in Europeans. Today's population descends disproportionately from the survivors, those whose bodies, for various genetic reasons, could better withstand the onslaught of Yersinia pestis. Some scientists theorize that certain autoimmune diseases more common in European populations, conditions where the immune system attacks the body's own tissues, might be an unintended consequence of this selection. Our ancestors survived the plague because their immune responses were particularly vigorous. That same heightened reactivity, however, may predispose their descendants to conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, where the immune system becomes overactive. These biological connections between past and present remind us that pandemics don't merely kill and then vanish from history. They reshape the genetic makeup of the surviving population, creating changes that persist for centuries or even millennia after the immediate crisis passes. The Black Death's social and economic transformations proved equally long-lasting. Though the immediate aftermath, the labour shortages, wage increases and social mobility we explored last night, and eventually faded as Europe's population recovered, certain fundamental changes became permanent. Consider the institution of serfdom, which had bound peasants to the land for generations before the plague. In Western Europe, this system never fully recovered from the disruption caused by the Black Death, though landlords attempted to reimpose old restrictions. The demographic reality worked against them. Land remained relatively abundant and labour scarce for centuries, giving workers leverage that gradually eroded feudal obligations. By the end of the Middle Ages, serfdom had largely disappeared from England, France, and the Low Countries, replaced by various rental arrangements that allowed much greater personal freedom. Peasants still worked the land, but increasingly as tenants who paid rent rather than as serfs, bound by hereditary obligations of labour and subservience. Eastern Europe followed a different path. There, the nobility succeeded in reimposing and even strengthening serfdom after the plague, creating what historians call the second serfdom that would persist into the 19th century. This divergence between Western and Eastern European social systems, one moving toward greater freedom for common people, the other toward more rigid control, would profoundly influence these regions' subsequent development. The Black Death also accelerated fundamental changes in religious life. The Catholic Church, which had dominated medieval intellectual and spiritual life, faced challenges to its authority in the plague's aftermath. Questions about why prayers went unanswered, why religious processions failed to stop the disease, and why devout monks died alongside sinners created cracks in the edifice of unquestioning faith. These cracks would widen in later centuries. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, with its challenge to Catholic authority and emphasis on individual interpretation of Scripture, found fertile ground in a population already predisposed to question religious orthodoxy. While the Reformation had many causes, historians see echoes of plague-era disillusionment in the willingness of millions to break with centuries of tradition. Even art and literature were transformed by the Black Death experience. Medieval artwork often focused on religious themes, depicting biblical stories, saints' lives, and divine figures. After the plague, new motifs appear, the dance of death showing skeletons, leading people from all social classes to the grave, reminders of mortality in still life paintings, a greater focus on the human experience rather than purely divine matters. This shift toward humanism, attention to human experience, emotion, and achievement, would blossom in the Renaissance. Along with reclaimed classical knowledge from Greek and Roman sources, this human-centered perspective would fundamentally alter how Europeans understood themselves and their world. The plague's impact extended even to language. Our modern English vocabulary still carries echoes of the Black Death experience. We speak of quarantine, a word derived from the Italian quarantina giorni, or 40 days, the length of time ships were required to remain isolated in Venetian harbours during plague outbreaks. We describe someone as having a deadline, originally a line drawn around a prison beyond which guards could shoot escaping prisoners, but similar to the boundaries drawn around quarantined plague areas. Even seemingly innocuous childhood rhymes may carry plague memories. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down has been interpreted by some as a reference to plague symptoms, the rosy rash, attempted remedies, sweet-smelling posies, carried to ward off disease, and outcome, ashes from cremation, falling down in death. Though scholars debate this interpretation, it suggests how deeply plague imagery may be embedded in cultural memory.